سويدا تقع تحت الحصار. الحصار هذا مطبق من قبل الحكومة. المساعدات اللي عم تجي ما بتغطي 1% من احتياجات المحافظة. عندنا 33 قرية محروقة، عندنا قرابة 190 ألف نازح من القرى المحروقة على الريف الجنوبي وعلى مدينة سويدا وعلى شهبة. المساعدات اللي عم تجي ما بتغطي. سويدا ظلت 15 يوم بدون كهرباء، بدون انترنت.
ما بده العلم يمشي من هون.
اليوم هو يوم 18 من الحصار على سويدا. كلنا واقفين لحتى نطلب بفك الحصار. الإعلام السوري كاذب. نحن الناجين والناجيات اللي عم نقول ونملك الحقيقة أن الحصار ما زال مستمر. سويدا تحت الحصار، سويدا تحت النار. أهم شيء حاليا نحن يفك الحصار عن كل المدنيين. ما في كهرباء، ما في مي، ما في أبدا دخول المحروقات على المنطقة.
يم الشاهد نحن أولادك، يم الشاهد نحن أولادك.
نطالب بحماية دولية ولجنة تحقيق دولية. هاي اللجان اللي عم يبعثوها لجان متطرفة، هاي ما مش مقبولة بالسويدا، ما راح يقبلون. ونطالب بمعبر حدودي إنساني. نحن لا كهرباء، لا مي، لا بنزين، لا غذاء. هاي المضافات عنا اتعبت من أهلنا بالقرى الغربية.
لو سمحتوا عمي.
نبديك يا سويدا، بالروح بالدم، نبديك يا سويدا.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching this stream on YouTube, on Rumble, and on Ganjing, where today I'm going to have our special guest, Kit Klarenberg, investigative journalist. His Substack is in the description below, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with him, especially about the role of the MI6 cutouts in Syria and the MI6 itself directly. In the previous live streaming, guys, I have addressed Kit's article, and I have shown you some scripts of it, that how one of these NGOs had a direct role in rebranding and rehabilitating Jolani regime. And today we're going to have more in-depth analysis in this. Kit, thank you so much for coming to the show.
My pleasure, Kevork. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. We're still living here in the winter. It's rainy outside. We haven't seen yet a lot of sunshine here. And I know that in your place, it's very hot at the current moment. And I come from the Middle East. I'm missing that a little bit. But we will fix that soon, hopefully, with the global warming that we are promised here in Germany.
Yeah.
Red Access, thank you so much, brother, for moderating the live chat today. The video that I played at the beginning, my friends, is from Sweda in the southern governorate in Sweda in south of Syria. And the Jolani regime has imposed a siege on the city. So not much is going in and going out from the city. And the other day, I found out the wife of one of my very good friends, she traveled from Europe to see her parents in Syria, and she's from Sweden, and she was stuck in the city. And then I saw a video of them reunited again inside the city because the guy traveled from Europe for her in order to bring her out of the city. And it's a really dire situation there. And those who are responsible for this suffering, we're going to speak about them today. Kit, I have followed your investigation, and I'm really fascinated by the depth of this information there. For the people at the beginning, I just want to give a little bit of context that this organization that we're going to talk about, the Intermediate, it was founded by Jonathan Powell, and he was a former Tony Blair advisor. And everybody knows Tony Blair's direct role in the invasion and the destruction of Iraq. And right after the coup or the regime change in Syria, Tony Blair hosted Ahmed Shibani, who is the foreign minister of Jolani, in Davos during the meeting there. And nowadays, Jonathan Powell is Starmer's national security advisor. So in your piece, you reveal that this organization, the Intermediate, facilitated secret engagement with HTS or al-Nusra and even maintained a presence inside Syria's new presidential palace. And this is mind-boggling, to be honest with you. Do we have an evidence about the presence of this organization inside the presidential palace? And how does this embedded access imply about the depth of the MI6 influence within the Jolani regime structure?
Well, it's really quite astonishing, isn't it? So, I mean, the Mail on Sunday, which actually, rather amazingly for a British newspaper, occasionally does some serious investigative journalism from time to time, and also hosts dissident voices like Peter Hitchens. Yes. On July 19th, it revealed that, I mean, we already knew, and I've already reported on how Intermediate, this very shadowy spook staff firm run by Jonathan Powell, had been grooming HTS for power since 2023 at the very least, if not considerably longer. But the Mail on Sunday revealed that Intermediate has a dedicated office in the Syrian presidential palace. Now, of course, that's absolutely shocking. But I mean, given my history of reporting more widely on British penetration of government structures, of state structures, of police and security and intelligence forces the world over, in particular, perhaps West Asia, I instantly understood that this is very, very, very bad. For want of a better word, because that level of direct contact affords the British an enormous level of influence, if not outright control, over what the Syrian government does and doesn't do.
Yes.
Now, I mean, in the immediate aftermath of HTS seizing power very violently, there were certain people who were very shocked at how the new HTS government was not responding militarily to ongoing Israeli strikes on the country, which were obliterating its industrial and military infrastructure. Those strikes continue today, and they remain unresponded to. While Yolani, or whatever moniker he's going by this week, openly states that they are seeking normalization of Israel. Bashar Assad, of course, having drawn a not insignificant source of his popularity with Syrians for his failure to recognize the Zionist entity. Now, the obvious question has to be asked is whether Intermediate is influencing the government to do nothing while Israel illegally annexes its territory and yet carries out unmolested attacks on its territory, and indeed government security forces, if you can even call them that, are carrying out brutal crackdowns on ethnic and religious minorities in Syria. Are MI6 pulling the strings here and giving advice on how Yolani's gang of Al-Qaeda and ISIS-connected thugs operate?
Indeed, in this case, it's always mind-boggling for me the role of the Brits, especially in North Africa and in the Middle East. I mean, it started in the mid 1920s when the Brits were the mandate power in Egypt, and they wanted to find a rift between the nationalists, the socialists, and the Islamists. So they have empowered in one way or another the spawn on the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they found this natural enemy against the nationalists and the socialists back then in the country. And this has been, the UK had a track record, let's say, in supporting this type of groups, to the extent that sometimes when I turn on my TV outlet, Al Jazeera, because they host a lot of these Muslim Brotherhood types, right? And they all the time, London, the location is always London, right? But this is one step further, this is a direct intervention to install someone like Jolani in power in Damascus. And in this case, I would really like to ask you, to what extent do you think this Jolani's rise was part of a deliberate long game British strategy rather than a reactive development. You know, like sometimes they say we were managing this crisis and this was the alternative and we brought him to power. Was this a momentary support, or this was a strategy, long-term strategy?
I think absolutely the latter. It is abundantly clear. I have reported on this for the Cradle and the Grey Zone. I would urge your viewers and listeners to check this out. I've reported on leaked British government documents that showed that, you know, back in 2019, you know, after Assad declared the war over, the British were running a variety of secret, basically intelligence programs. That under the cover of aid operations. So, I mean, I'm sure that most people will be familiar with the White Helmets and the Free Syria Police, but it didn't end there. Like, they were involved in trying to build these statelets in opposition occupied territory. Now, what's very bizarre about the leaked documents is that it is constantly stressed by the British Foreign Office and the constellation of contractors they were using to run these shady clandestine programs under the cover of aid, we need to do this to undermine HTS. But it also notes that it's important to operate in the areas governed by HTS because HTS leaves them alone. Now, I mean, we have to ask ourselves why that was. You know, an obvious interpretation is that, you know, Yilani knew that they were being run by the British, so said, yeah, like, you know, allow them to operate with impunity. But a slightly more anodyne explanation may be that, when you know, these British projects were providing you know, aid and support to people in opposition occupied or HTS occupied territory, they were helping cement HTS as a governance actor. You know, and I think that for many years, not that it got very much mainstream attention at the time, but we had Yilani issuing all sorts of statements about what he wanted to see in a future Syria. With, you know, I mean, a lot of it read as if it was written for him by the IMF. I mean, you know, talking about opening up Syria's vast resources for plunder by Western corporations, wide-ranging privatization, you know, all sorts of buzzwords which are associated with, you know, liberal reformer in the your Anglo-American lexicon. You know, no matter your internal, how brutally repressive you are, as long as you're prostrating yourself to Western capital, you can be forgiven pretty much anything. You know, so there are very obvious questions about how conscious Britain was about the fact that by doing this in HTS occupied territory, they were shoring up HTS power, increasing their popularity and credibility with local populations who were, of course, suffering under absolutely grinding sanctions that prevented Syria importing basic supplies when it's about a third of the country, particularly its resource-rich territories, were occupied by foreign soldiers. You know, so they were looking to anyone in that context to deliver them from it, no matter how minorly. And I think, you know, the HTS filled that gap for, at least in the areas that they ran in Syria. I think that they're very clearly running into problems already by claiming to be a national government. I mean, quite what will remain of Syria, what Syria will look like in 5 years' time is anyone's guess. But yes, my general theory, and I've been saying this for a very long time, is, of course, we know that the US has had designs on Syria for decades, and that there was a dedicated regime change, dirty war instigated by the CIA along with the Qataris and the Israelis to try and get rid of Assad. But the British always seemed to be keener for the US to go a lot further.
Yes.
and they were in charge of propaganda operations, promoting the opposition as moderate alternatives to Assad, staging chemical weapons attacks, and the explicit purpose of this was to try and get US intervention, whether that was bombing or even outright boots on the ground. But the US always seemed like less than enthused about the getting embroiled in yet another war in West Asia after the scathing embarrassments of Iraq and the ongoing failure of the at the time Afghan occupation. So the British have always seemed a lot more gung-ho on this than the Americans, willing to go further, willing to cut deals and accommodate the most violent extreme elements on the ground in Syria. So I would suggest that the plan to install Yolani and his henchmen in the Syrian presidential palace was long in the making, and London was the center of it. Now, I think that there is a very interesting coincidence here, which is that Jonathan Powell assumes his role as Starmer's national security advisor, as you said, which makes him the second most powerful person in the British government, potentially. That was mere days before his clients in HTS seized power in Syria. And how does Starmer respond to HTS seizing power in Syria? He took the lead on hailing this as a positive development for Syria and the Syrian people. He dispatched high-ranking diplomats to meet with HTS representatives in Damascus. This was despite the British media acknowledging that this was completely illegal because HTS are a prescribed terror group under British law. Yeah, and I think most eerily as well was that I think it was on the day that Assad fled the country, Starmer said his departure means a more active role for the British in West Asia. But I mean, that is deeply suspicious when you factor in Powell's role in all of this. I think that subsequent developments have just pointed ever more intensely in the direction of London as the puppet masters here.
They will definitely play a more active role, especially that they have lots of assets nowadays, as you mentioned, in the Jolani regime. One of the personalities which I covered in a separate article, the title is "The Imbeciles Who Installed Al-Qaeda in Power." I mentioned one of the female activists, let's say. Let's talk about one of the most visible faces of this operation, Vazan Safur, a British Syrian advisor to Jolani. She's the media advisor to Jolani, and so was educated with a media-savvy profile and a carefully curated presence on Western platforms. She's been a vocal figure defending the regime's actions in Syria, even as reports of mass kidnappings and civilian massacres mount. What is weird is that she had never set foot in Syria before December of last year. She was born in the UK and lived there all her life, only glimpsing Syria from the Turkish border during brief NGO-related work. Her father was a non-Muslim Brotherhood figure, yes, but still, how does a woman with no local political roots suddenly become an official advisor to Jolani just 1 month after arriving? How does she get a seat at the table with Mohammed bin Salman? Who opened those doors? Was she parachuted in by Jonathan Powell and the Intermediate Network? As of now, there is no public record confirming that she works for Intermediate, but does it really matter? The ecosystem of British foreign policy, soft power, and regime change assets is tightly knit. Whether through NGOs, diplomatic back channels, or civil society facades, they are all reading from the same imperial script. Safur, regardless of formal affiliation, is clearly part of the apparatus selling Jolani to the West. Now, some of our guests, some of our commentators, like our moderator here, is asking, why do the British spend so much on supporting Islamism? I mean, he means this type of Muslim Brotherhood, HTS type of Islamism, when they don't seem to benefit much from it. I mean, I'm sure you mean in the UK, not outside the UK, because outside the UK, they do benefit from it. Not many contracts for their companies. Like, why is this obsession with this type of Islamist groups from the UK side, especially in countries like Syria, Egypt, Egypt and in other places where it's clearly those groups are regressive powers, right? They don't bring any sort of social development into the country, but they open the markets, as you mentioned, probably to foreign investors. That would be the turning point.
Yeah, well, it's that I mean, that's precisely it, and I think that I mean, I've written about this, and I do think that it's an important analogy to make, which is that when the NATO powers decided to break up Yugoslavia, which kind of it was capped off with this 78-day-long saturation bombing of this basically defenseless country, they specifically targeted economic infrastructure because Yugoslavia had an independent economy. It wasn't a member of the World Bank. It wasn't a member of the World Trade Organization. It wasn't a member of the IMF. Syria wasn't a member of them either. Under Assad, this is how the wider Anglo-American empire gets its hooks into countries, forever putting them under the heel of crippling debts that they can never pay and are constantly having to restructure and pay off via privatization and that sort of thing. I mean, in terms of the commenter said that it doesn't make much. The British don't actually make much out of this. I would severely, strongly counter that, and I have written about the role that British intelligence plays in breaking down opposition in the North Africa and West Asia to the activities of BP, for example. So, I recently, you can find it on my website, shameless plug, but I wrote about how an MI6 cutout was involved in effectively trying to create a safe investment environment in Libya, training their security, the government security and law enforcement agencies to effectively prevent attacks on economic infrastructure, including, say, like BP drilling points, which can often be very controversial. To give you another example, in Egypt, I have documented how British intelligence enlisted the services of Reuters to help overthrow Mohamed Morsi. One of the first things that Morsi did when he entered office was that he reversed a completely insane deal for oil and gas exploration in the West Nile Delta that Morsi's predecessor, what was his name? I can't remember. The Egyptian president.
Sisi or Morsi?
Or Morsi's predecessor. Yeah, Mubarak. Sorry, yes. Yeah, so Mubarak signed this completely insane deal with BP, whereby they would be granted 100% of the profits for anything that gleaned from their West Nile Delta project, and it was an area of the country the same size as Croatia that they got to explore it. In the process, in establishing infrastructure for pillaging this oil and gas, they displaced vast amounts of locals. It was extremely unpopular. Morsi tried to renegotiate the terms of the deal, and he appointed as his energy minister an academic who had been extremely critical of the West Nile Delta deal. And then the second that Sisi seizes power in a violent coup, the deal's back on the table without restrictions. So they do benefit from this, and also there is that mafioso element of not wanting anyone to step out of line. Syria, I think, particularly when it became clear, and you can see this from British intelligence documents, actually, that from the earliest stages of this, they were expecting a Libya-style regime change that was going to topple Assad. And I've said this on X, and I shall repeat it here. The one that got away is a very potent motivating factor in Anglo-American thinking. Like, if you look at the enormous money, time, and energy, and just pure cruelty that's been expended trying to hammer Cuba into this tiny island for trying to arrange its affairs in its own way for decades, like for daring to not be a colony up for untrammeled plunder. Assad stubbornly held on, and this probably strengthened the resolve of the Americans, but particularly the British, to get rid of him for daring to stand up to them.
You know, when I'm checking your website, Kit, I just did a little experiment. It's not an experiment, just a search. And I typed in your website MI6. So we have how MI6 helped HTS with Syria. Stefan Bandera's sinister MI6 alliance exposed. The CIA MI6 Skripal conspiracy exposed. MI6 coup in Macedonia unravels. How CIA and MI6 created ISIS. Declassified. BBC and MI6 Kosovo war propaganda blitz. Syrian woman exploited in MI6 propaganda ops. Exposing CIA MI6 justice operations in Syria. How MI6 infiltrated neutral Switzerland. And finally leaked how MI6 exploits Palestinian refugees. Guys, his website, his Substack are all in the description below. It would be amazing if you follow his work because he's doing a really relentless, amazing investigations on his website. But the personal question here would be for you, Kit. You were detained by the counterterrorism police, and upon your arrival in your own country, and now the officials in your country are not only shaking hands with the notorious terrorist, they have legitimized his own regime. It's still a prescribed organization. I want you to share with us your feelings. You know, when you see such footage, for example, Lamy shaking hands with Jolani, which, by the way, I almost lost my channel because I published that photo on my YouTube channel, and then I had lots of pressure on YouTube until they lifted the warning. But when I'm watching photos like this, for example, to be honest with you, like, look, I'm Syrian. We are journalists, but we also have feelings, right? And when I see this photo, I feel disgusted because when I was a kid, and when in 2003, I cried when I saw Baghdad falling into the hands of the occupiers, one of whom was Tony Blair, one of the engineers. And now this is only a few days after the regime change operation, and Tony Blair is sitting with Ahmed Shibani, who was himself a militant in Al-Nusra, in Al-Qaeda itself. How does Kit feel about this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? And I think that, like, yes, I mean, when I got detained, which is now over 2 years ago now. It was back in May 2023. It was the last time, might be the last time ever I fly back to the UK unless I'm in shackles or something. But that was on the basis of my reporting explicitly for the Grey Zone, and it was a deeply traumatizing experience. I thought that the negative public backlash might discourage Britain from doing this again, but they've actually just intensified their crackdowns. And I know a great many people personally. I mean, to the extent that I might even forget if I tried to name them all. You know, like people like Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who turned whistleblower. Steve Sweeney recently got detained, had all of his electronic devices stolen. Sweeney is a excellent veteran reporter who lives in Lebanon. And David Miller got stopped coming back from Iran. They've just intensified this significantly. And there are names that I'm forgetting off the top of my head here. But like, there is a kind of sick irony in someone like David Lammy, who, I mean, I might add that very interestingly, and I think that this is something we should potentially get into more, is that the Mail on Sunday noted that the real forces in British defence and foreign policy are effectively, yes, Jonathan Powell, who founded this firm that helped on MI6's behalf, HCSC's power, and now has an office in the Syrian presidential palace. He along with Peter Mandelson, who is like Charles Powell, like Jonathan Powell, a long-time Blair confidant, considered a top trusted person from Blair's perspective, who have very powerful networks within government and within the private sector. The Mail on Sunday acknowledged that Lammy plays a ceremonial role, operating according to a script that people like Powell and Mandelson draw up for him, which is pretty astonishing. really. And I think that the point is yes, that like I mean Lamy did this chummy smiling photo op with Yolani, and I just thought, pictures say 1,000 words, don't they? And then meanwhile we have had on the July 1st, the British government made the totally unprecedented move of prescribing Palestine action, and I might have to choose my words carefully here, because it's now a very serious criminal offence in Britain to support the group. And people have been arrested for supporting Palestine action for wearing T-shirts that don't mention the group but do mention the word action. I'm not kidding. This has happened in the UK. So yeah, I think that there is I mean, it's Lamy, of course, is not going to be getting stopped when he enters Britain and have his electronic devices shaken down and be interrogated under threat of arrest without a right to silence for 6 hours, as I and countless other people were. And I think it's a very interesting demonstration of who and what the British state does and doesn't view as threats, and why. And I mean, again, to go back to your viewer's point, I mean, if you are asking cui bono and there are no obvious answers forthcoming, you've got to bear in mind, as I say, just ensure bringing the Middle East to or West Asia to heel is this like ongoing obsession of the British and the French and their imperial successor, America. It's crushing independence for independence sake. It is ensuring that alternative structures don't emerge or don't prosper, and it's about ensuring that Israel is not surrounded by threats to its existence. I mean, we see this with in say Jordan, where their entire police, security, and intelligence apparatus is run by the British. They teach Jordan. I mean, bear in mind, Jordan's a country where you can get jailed for posting memes on social media. Yeah. Britain dispatches GCHQ veterans to teach people how to hack into people's phones and stuff. I mean, nobody knows about any of this. I mean, I have written about it for the Cradle, nonetheless. But it's like that you want pliant governments who will do whatever you ask them to, and will not represent the wishes or interests or views of their populations, and will bend over backwards to facilitate the endurance and expansion of the Zionist project. So even if there's not an immediate commercial interest in crushing a country, and there usually actually is, if you look hard enough, just pure control for control's sake, and indeed for the Zionist entity's benefit, are ends and objectives in and of themselves.
The other day, a friend of mine who is a musician here, he told me he's going to do an event in London in September, and he invites me. He wants me to come as a guest. His guest, and I said, "Thank you so much," because I know upon my landing, I mean, the least thing they could do is just take your electronics and suck your data and try to, blackmail you or try to compromise your sources, this and that. And this has become like the new normal, as you mentioned. I mean, people who have some relevance or let's say presence on social media outlets who speak about such important matters, which everybody should be concerned about, because this is a state policy of installing an Al-Qaeda type of regime in Syria. And this will have repercussions, and not only on the region, but also around the world, because then you have a hub of a terrorist nest, basically, in West Asia, which is Syria is not an isolated island. It has borders with other countries. It has been millions of people left the country, became refugees to the outside world. So grooming this type of people, bringing them into power, I think it's a really bad signal, and also normalizes in the region. They normalize among the people, among the youngsters, that if you want to become relevant and if you want to be politically relevant and reach to power and be a participant in the political life, then you have to join groups like Al-Qaeda. And this will give them another excuse later to come to the Middle East and say we're fighting against terrorism, but they're the ones who bring this type of players, let's say, into power, especially in the Middle East. But would you, Kit, say that this intermediate operation reflects a deeper ideological lineage within British foreign policy? I mean, how much what we are witnessing today is Blairism from Tony Blair 2.0 by other means? Is this the continuation of the old foreign policy with different masks?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's I mean, Blair is a much hated figure, and quite rightly, for what he did in invading Iraq and amongst a great many other horrendous crimes. But I think that his impact on not only British but Western government thinking and action is something that's not really examined and not really perhaps kind of missing from people's context and comprehension of what's happened over the past 25 years. So, I mean, I mentioned the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999. Blair was the one pushing for, pushing for all-out invasion against American wishes in the country. He was he was very belligerent. He supported and pushed for, against the advice of government legal advisors, for ever greater aggression, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, and the ruining of people's lives on a grand scale. During this, he had the temerity to give a speech, which is in Chicago, which has become known as, I think it's the doctrine of the new international community or something similar. And it is effectively a neocon script. This is the best part of 2 years before George Bush comes to power, and subsequent to 9/11, he gets surrounded by neoconservatives who have the same ideas as Blair does. But in this speech, he effectively talks about how it is the West's responsibility as the kind of enlightened superior part of the world to go around the globe intervening in other people's conflicts for humanitarian quote unquote reasons. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the death and destruction and misery around the world is a direct result of Blair pushing for this doctrine. And he's still doing it. The Tony Blair Foundation for Global Change, or I think that's what it's the Institute for Global Change. I mean, it publishes papers openly calling for revolution in Iran. It boasts of having cultivated networks of anti-government activists in troublesome West Asian countries. That desire to reshape the West Asia and control it, it's gone nowhere. Now, Jonathan Powell's role in this is very interesting. I go into it in my piece, but I think it's important to drill into here. Is he was, as Tony Blair's chief of staff, which was a position that had never existed in British government before. This like unelected political appointee who can give government ministers, if not departments, orders they have to follow. He and including the intelligence services. In September 2002, MI6 produced a dossier on Iraq's alleged chemical and biological weapons capabilities. Powell personally intervened to tell the heads of Britain's intelligence community, you need to significantly harden the wording to make Iraq sound like a very grave military threat when assessments find that they're not. And in discussions with Blair's notorious spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, they said, Powell said, well, we need to be thinking about what do we want the headlines of the newspapers to be once this assessment of Iraqi capabilities are released. And lo and behold, the sexed up dossier claimed that Saddam could attack the West within 45 minutes. And this was front paged on every British newspaper. It was it heavily informed the Bush administration's case for war against Iraq. And it was a lie. its sole source was an Iraqi taxi driver, reportedly. But it had an absolutely devastating impact. Now, I also mentioned in the piece that there was a recent and rather damning profile of Powell in The Spectator, where it acknowledged that, yes, that Powell knew that the Iraq posed no military threat, but he believed with Blair's doctrine that, we need to get rid of ruthless dictators via military force. And reportedly, he still has the same instincts today, despite the complete disasters of Western intervention in West Asia since 2001. You know, they're still determined to use soft and hard power in order to stoke conflict and then play good guys by stamping it out. Which is, what played out in Syria. And I think that what's interesting as well is that when Intermediate, when their role in grooming HTS for power was revealed by Independent Arabia. I didn't even know that the Independent had an Arabic outlet, but apparently it does. But in the weeks prior to this, there was the US ambassador to Syria 2011 to 2014, Robert Ford, who was kind of at the forefront of when they really started going for regime change against Assad, and the plan floundered due to the tenacity of the Syrian people and its armed forces. That he, a few weeks prior to the Independent Arabia revealing Intermediate's role, he spoke of how, yes, in 2023, a British non-governmental organisation sought his personal assistance in rebranding HTS as politicians rather than terrorists. And he didn't, Ford didn't mention Intermediate, and there was much speculation about which company this was, because there were so many British intelligence cutouts active in Syria. You just had up on screen a number of investigations of mine covering MI6 skullduggery. One of the most interesting from my perspective, and the most kind of damning and illuminating investigations I've done recently, is how there was a British company called ARC, which is run by a veteran MI6 officer called Alistair Harris. They were involved in Syria from day one. In May 2011, ARC sets up this very, very shady international justice organization called the Commission. It's Commission for International Justice and Accountability. CIJA is its name. They set that up in May 2011 to prosecute Syrian government officials for war crimes. Now, in May 2011, the war hadn't even started yet. The army hadn't been deployed formally to deal with the foreign fomented unrest in Syria. So how in May 2011 did an MI6 tied firm have the thought, well, there are going to be war crimes committed and there's going to be a war, so we need to establish some kind of mechanism for prosecuting officials for this. But also their entire business model depended on regime change. It depended on Assad's government falling. So they quite clearly, from the initial stages of this, were looking ahead to all-out intervention to get rid of Assad at a very early stage.
I think you know what explains this, my friend. There was a former French foreign minister. He has a video speaking on France 24, basically saying that 2 years before the eruption of the war in Syria, he was approached by his British counterpart, asking him if he would like to be part of a regime change operation, which is going to start in Syria 2 years later. He revealed this on France 24. I'm trying to find this video at the current moment. I couldn't yet, but I will definitely. So this was definitely when you start an armed insurgency or train some of these insurgents, you know that this regime in Syria, the former one, they will respond in a military manner. And once they respond in a military manner, you come with your, as you mentioned, the soft power, the PSYOPs, the NGOs, the media outlets, the cutouts. You create sentiments in the country, and you make it about also sectarian war, because this is the easiest way to flame this type of wars in the Middle East. And they were successful. This is the thing that I'm trying to explain to my friends and followers here, that the Brits were successful in Syria, and the Brits were also using this you mentioned soft power as privatized diplomacy, and by doing so they were also giving the intelligence services the opportunity to bypass basically democratic scrutiny and democratic institutions in the UK itself. So this is basically a war being waged on other countries on different layers, some of which is soft power, others are hard power, without even the knowledge of the British public.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's what I another aspect that I find quite interesting is the British role has come out, the kind of prominent leading British role in trying to unseat Assad. It has kind of filtered out via the mainstream media, although people have short attention spans and short memories these days, and they get rather forgotten. So, I mean, for example, John Jenkins, who was this kind of veteran British diplomat and was London's special representative to Libya following the NATO bombing and the ouster and murder of Gaddafi during 2011, he subsequently became the British ambassador to Saudi Arabia and was personally involved in August 2013 in efforts to, on the British government's behalf, to get Saudi Arabia on board with an all-out invasion of Syria. And reportedly, the Saudis were extremely frustrated when the Britain and America stepped back. There was, of course, an alleged and very dubious chemical weapons attack in Ghouta, which led to a British parliamentary vote in favour of intervention in Syria, which actually the government lost. That was, and I think that might have put the US off outright intervention. But again, the British never seem to have fully given up. And I mentioned that they were staging chemical weapons attacks to try and trigger intervention. They were also, MI6 was also running operations to smuggle soil samples and alleged evidence of government chemical weapons use out of Syria. Yes. And there's this amazing report in the Daily Mirror where there is a it confirms that MI6 played the quote-unquote leading role in this evidence-gathering mission. And there's a nameless official quoted by the Daily Mirror who states, the Americans want more evidence before agreeing that Assad has crossed the line in the use of chemical weapons. And the reason we're doing this is basically to foment all-out war. And they lament that, well, if the West doesn't do anything about this, there was not really any point in doing the tests, or quote-unquote tests. So yeah, this aspect is I think rather lost on people who typically see Syria as a predominantly CIA or Israeli influenced and directed operation. No, I mean there were many different foreign players in this, but I would put Britain at the very forefront of it for a variety of reasons. And now that they've managed to install HTS in Syria, I don't think they're going to be deterred from trying it elsewhere. Quite the reverse, in fact.
You remember when I told you the foreign minister, former foreign minister of France, Roland Dumas, and this is where he mentions basically that 2 years earlier he was approached by the Brits.
Moi, je vais vous dire quelque chose. J'étais il y a 2 ans à peu près, avant que les hostilités commencent en Syrie. Je me trouvais en Angleterre par hasard pour d'autres choses, pas du tout de la Syrie. J'ai rencontré des responsables anglais et quelques-uns qui sont mes amis m'ont avoué, en me sollicitant, qu'il se préparait quelque chose en Syrie. C'était en Angleterre et pas en Amérique. L'Angleterre préparait l'invasion des rebelles en Syrie. Et on m'a même demandé à moi, sous le prétexte que j'étais ancien ministre des Affaires étrangères, si je participerais comme ça. J'ai évidemment dit le contraire. J'ai dit, écoutez, moi, je suis français, ça ne m'intéresse pas. Mais c'est pour dire que cette opération vient de très loin. Elle a été préparée, conçue, organisée.
Dans quel but Excusez-moi, dans quel but? L'idée de renverser Bachar, c'était quoi le but? La finalité?
Mais dans le but très simple, de destituer le gouvernement syrien, parce que dans la région, il est important de savoir que ce régime syrien a des propos anti-israéliens. Et que par conséquent, tout ce qui bouge dans la région autour, moi j'ai la confidence du Premier ministre israélien qui remonte très longtemps, qui m'avait dit on essaiera de s'entendre avec le Premier ministre, avec les États autour. Et ceux qui ne s'entendront pas, on les abattra. C'est une politique, c'est une conception de l'histoire. Pourquoi pas, après tout? Mais il faut le savoir.
Isn't it hilarious that this type of politicians do not exist any longer in Western countries, like in France, in Britain, people who speak really honestly about the real factors why they have come after Syria, and it wasn't about democracy and human rights. Really, the quality of the politicians also have dropped immensely in Western countries. I think your microphone is also off, Kit.
Yeah, sorry, that's because there was thunderclaps outside. It's now raining heavily, so
no worries.
Like some respite from the heat, perhaps. But yeah, that clip is absolutely extraordinary, and I do think that there has been a very concerted effort over the past 10 years, if not more, to purge people who speak so forthrightly about the realities of Western policy from positions of power. I mean, we think about. I mean, in Britain, one of the most outspoken critics of regime change targeting Assad was Peter Ford, who was the former British ambassador to Syria, who has spoke very openly about the likelihood that the opposition, the Western-backed opposition, which was in no way moderate, was carrying out staged chemical weapons attacks, was responsible for horrendous atrocities, and dared utter the very inconvenient truth that Assad was actually very popular, which was acknowledged before the protest started, but kind of vanished from mainstream consideration once they finally erupted after months of demands for days of rage by Syrian exiles and foreign sponsored figures. So I think that from the British government's perspective, they're probably ever so slightly exhausted by the fact that it took them so long. But I mean, their determination to do this can't be doubted. I mean, I mentioned the Libya example. Once Gaddafi was ousted and replaced by this kind of puppet administration, which lasted a few months before the country descended into basically civil war with different militias and factions, basically, and including ISIS, tearing the country apart and turning it into an open-air slave market. Britain spent many years making Tripoli safe for Western rape and pillage. I think the expectation was, well, we'll get an instant return from this, and then that didn't ultimately come to pass. But they still clung on and carried on. And the same story plays out in Syria. They never gave up these operations and programs, which the overwhelming majority of the British public have no idea about and no say in, continued apace for nearly a decade and a half. But I mean, if there's a positive to be gleaned from this, I mean, I do, as much as the horrific scenes of attacks on Alawites and other religious and ethnic minorities in Syria are, I do think that by unseating Assad, whatever short-term gains from Britain's perspective there are, I think on a longer term, I mean, the government still has no legitimacy with average Syrians. There is still opposition, some of it armed, to their rule, and also it's opened given rise to a feeding frenzy where you suddenly have all of these regional players, including Israel, but Turkey's another one, where they all have different aims and objectives in Syria. And they are frequently at odds. I mean, I've seen it reported that Israel was begging Russia not to withdraw its military bases from the country and begging the US to let them stay, because it's like, well, you've created this massive disaster. Well, what now? Well, there's no.
Turkey will fill with the vacuum.
yeah. There's no planning for what comes after. And on this subject, I've just written, and it should be coming out on my website in the next few days. There's this extraordinary report from an Israeli think tank, which is very influential. It's called the Institute for National Security Studies, and it is relied upon by the Zionist entity to shape quote unquote defense and security policy, and it calls for regime change in Iran and sets out different ways that Israel could try to achieve this, while also acknowledging that the possibility of all of these methods, including, say, assassinating Khomeini or attempting to sponsor exile groups abroad that are opposed to the Islamic Republic, they're likely to boomerang pretty spectacularly. You know, like so they have this, and the document also, I might add, it acknowledges that, well, even if we do manage to somehow implausibly overthrow the Iranian government, and the 12-day war, on top of being an absolute catastrophe from Israel's perspective, has unified Iran like never before against
actually that's one of the factors. Yes, I saw it objectively with my own eyes, with the Iranian the diaspora here, many of whom were against the Islamic Republic, but I also heard different speeches when the attack started, and they have family in Iran and their families were also under Israeli attack. So I found that fascinating to see some of the Iranians, let's say in the diaspora, they have gathered around their country again, something that I found personally missing among the Syrian diaspora, especially in Germany and in the United States, who were really collaborating with this type of MI6 cutouts, or also in the US, in the Congress, with the Zionist lobby, with the Qatari affiliated lobbies, etc., etc. This was a really long manufactured warfare with different layers against Syria. This should be a lesson for other countries also to be careful and worried and concerned about this type of NGO organizations in their own countries. And I don't know what's the solution in this globalized world. However, it's quite obvious nowadays that we have the facts in our hands that this type of organizations can destabilize countries and can do regime change wars and can change policies and can buy politicians, and they can also link and embed the financial interests of the politicians with the financial interests of the empire or the people who are in charge in the West. Kit, this was an amazing and fascinating discussion with you today. Your Substack and website is in the description below. What are you also doing? Are you also active? X is definitely also mentioned, but are you also in other platforms that you want the people to follow you?
Yeah, sure. So I run a podcast with my dear friend Alexander Mackay called Decline and Fall, which, as the title might imply, is about the decline and fall of the Anglo-American Empire. We do regular broadcasts. We do specials on particular topics. We have some great guests on regularly. So please do.
Active measures, huh?
Yeah. So please do check that out. I'm also, you can find me at the Grey Zone UK. We've again got some pretty spicy stuff to come on that. And yes, on the subject of X, you won't be able to find my account via Google, but you should, if you use the X search bar, track me down.
You're shadow banned.
At Kit Klarenberg. So hopefully see you there, guys. And no, thank you so much for having me on, Kevork. A superb and yes, very illuminating discussion all round, I think. God bless
Thank you so much, really. And God bless you too. It's really important to have people like yourself. And we are doing this for educational purposes, and the people appreciate it. That's why we will definitely have you back. And all the thanks also goes to the hundreds and hundreds of people who watch this on YouTube, on Rumble, on Ganjin World. I really appreciate you all, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's stream. If you like this content, the easy thing to do is only hit the like button, subscribe to this YouTube channel. If you like to support the independent work I'm doing, there are different means in the description below, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you so much, our dear friend Red Access, for moderating the live chat. Always amazing work you're doing there. Peace be upon you guys, upon your families, and a peace be upon you, Kit. Salam.
Peace be upon you.